question of sea level rise is closely related to the question of global warming, because both through the expansion of the ocean's mass due to warming, but also through the extra volume through the melting of land-based ice masses, such as those over the Antarctic and over countries such as Greenland and Iceland, both have the capacity to contribute to increasing ocean levels.
The map on the right comes from a presentation in 2007 to the West Australian Regional Organisation of Councils at Blacktown, where the conference was presented with the considerations of what would happen to Sydney were sea levels to rise by 14 metres. Now, literally, this would involve billions of dollars of property loss. However, there is one limiting complication, and that is that although decision makers are being presented with maps like this, and while there are current claims of predictions of sea level rises anywhere between 7 to 70 metres before the end of this century, there is actually no scientific support for this level of extreme sea level rise. When the CSIRO assessed the available studies, they considered all of the credible scientific investigations into sea level rise, and while they were amazed at the vast differences in both magnitude and direction of the conclusions of these different credible studies, they ended up adopting a range of between 0.2 to 0.6 metres. That's 20 centimetres to 60 centimetres between 1990 and 2100. And by and large, this modest range, about 0.4 of a metre or 40 centimetres, is largely what decision makers are taking into account now for the year 2100. Now, furthermore, as well as the more modest growth of only 0.4 of a metre rather than the 14 metres that were presented to property decision makers in Western Sydney, these predictions of sea level rise must be calibrated to the length of time that it is going to take for these rises to be realised. We're talking about 90 years into the future. And to put that into perspective, we can relate it to building life. Today, development tends to be for a building life of about 40 years. And by and large, we can see that 40-year-old buildings today are in need of major refurbishment or replacement. What this means is that even if the sea level were to rise by the 40 centimetres concluded by the CSIRO, or let's say it was a full 1 metre by the year 2100, that would be 2 building lives away. And what this means is that there would be ample time between now and the year 2100 to be able to make the necessary adjustment to boundaries. And largely, if we were to apply even a very modest level of depreciation to the land values that are going to eventually be inundated by the sea, we would find that the depreciation rates were in fact not only modest, but still considerably less than the depreciation rates normally applied to most productive assets, apart from property. And so what we can see is that we live in a world where even if sea level rises well in excess of the CSIRO scientific assessment were to be realised, the actual cost to real estate would be relatively minor, and it would be realised over such a long period of time that decision makers, at least prudent decision makers, would be able to factor those depreciation trajectories into their estimates into the future. And it would be unlikely that in the year 2100 there would be any buildings with the ocean sort of coming in halfway up the front door. Beyond the modelling futures that were taken into consideration by the CSIRO, it's worthwhile looking at history. If we look back over the past century or so, we find that the sea level has risen by about 170 millimetres over the past century. This is roughly between 1880 and the present. And there have been periods where sea level rise has actually decelerated. In other words, its rate of change has grown slower. And so if we look at the pattern of historical sea level rise, we find it's considerably more complex and overall considerably more moderate than what's being predicted into the future. At present, there are a number of scientists suggesting that the most credible expectation for the future is on the low end of the CSIRO assessment, that is, in the vicinity of about 20 centimetres. And if we look at 20 centimetres, that is shorter than an average student's ruler. That level of sea level rise is hardly likely to have a significant property impact, especially when it's moderated over the 90 or 100 years or so that it's likely to need to be realised. Taken overall, we see a vast contrast between the historical data and, in fact, the sober scientific assessments into the future that are currently available, compared with the alarming forecasts which are currently being given to property decision makers and politicians who are a fair way away from the science, but largely adopting it as though it was in some way valid. Sea level rise is only one of the potential impacts or adverse impacts of global temperature changes or climate change on property. Another, which is considerably more immediate and taking a fair bit of the property economists' attention, is the matter of green buildings. This is largely premised on the assumptions of anthropogenic global warming, in other words, humans are affecting climate change. By and large, a green building is one which does a number of things. It has low energy use, it includes some level of water conservation, it may attempt to be carbon neutral in its operation, and there are other limitations on the type of raw materials which are used in construction, especially with respect to things like low chlorine content of materials. When we look at their economic success, the value impacts of green buildings, we find that their economic success is largely dependent upon government sanction. What this means is that in the general open market, the market does not put a premium on green buildings. The fact that a building may use less energy or be a little bit more conservative with its water use, or it has less chlorine in the building materials, or in fact its operation is carbon neutral. Very little of this has any impact on the decision of tenants, and certainly it doesn't have a direct impact on rentals. And what this means is that when we look at the economic sense of green buildings, we find that it doesn't stack up until we take account of the artificial distortion of the market as a result of government policy. What we find is that at present there are directives on the public service that insist that they must locate in green buildings wherever possible. And what this means is the market is able to see that the public service, when it takes up private real estate, must locate within green buildings, and this places an edge, a margin, on the demand for green buildings as opposed to other buildings. There are also development approval limitations. Again, this is not something which is indicated by the market, demanded by the market, but rather put in place as a result of government statute, of planning limitations, limiting development approvals. Again, an artificial limit, which in the case of development approvals means that developers are now forced to build more expensive buildings because of the green fitting. Overall, what this means is that the taxpayers, the average member of the community, and to a certain extent the occupants, are funding the apparent attractiveness or the apparent economic success of green buildings. And they do this in a number of ways. Firstly, as taxpayers, their taxes are going to pay the higher rents that the public service is forced to pay when it occupies green buildings as a result of the positive policy of the government. And also as occupants, where tenants must occupy buildings which have been built to green standards by developers forced to build at that standard merely because of the limitations on development approval because of the planning authorities. What this means is that green buildings are not something that are accepted by the community because they value the greenness of the building, but rather it's an extra cost that the community is forced to bear as a result of government policy. You can see David Parker's 2008 article in the Australian Property Journal on the valuation of green buildings to get more data on the lack of evidence for the economic attractiveness of green buildings. The overall impact of the green building push is therefore something very different to what the community, and unfortunately the property economics fraternity, is being led to believe. Overall, the impacts are considerably less than what is being suggested, certainly when you take a sober scientific analysis. Overall, tenants of commercial buildings still prefer air conditioning and artificial lighting to having windows open and so on. And these alone mean that commercial buildings are using immensely more energy than they were, say, a generation ago. When we look at building waste, we find that the current tendency to build buildings with the life expectancy of only 40 years would be considered to be abhorrent by building standards and architectural standards up until about 40 or 50 years ago, where a building was built with the intention of it being there for a very long time, measured in centuries. If we go to some parts of the world, such as Europe, we find that it's not uncommon to find buildings built in the 15th and 16th centuries still being quite serviceable, and in fact being the preferred premises for a lot of activities. We can go to places like Oxford or Cambridge universities and see buildings built in the 1500s still making the core of the university, and we find similar in many other European cities. However, today we intentionally build buildings with the life expectancy of only 40 years. It is no surprise that currently landfills are occupied to about 50% by nothing apart from building waste. And what this means is there is a tremendous amount of material filling our garbage heaps, and in order to replace those, coming out of high energy use factories, whether they're making concrete or steel or other building materials, that need not be there if we were simply to change our building standards to the point where architects and engineers were to aim for building lives measured in centuries. We would immediately reduce our environmental footprint as a result of building quite considerably. However, this is not being considered. Overall, when we look at the impact of the green building initiatives that are currently being discussed, we find that they have more showcase than real scientific impact. While it's impressive to see a building which has reduced its energy use by, say, 10%, and we might give that a Green Star rating, we forget that 40 years ago, a building for the same purpose may have only used something like 30 or 40% of the amount of energy that the modern buildings are using anyway, which means that an office building, say built in the 1940s or the 1950s, before the advent of air conditioning, and when windows were large enough to let in a large amount of natural light, the supposed improvements that we're making today become really quite trivial. When we compare CBD building to the rest of society, we find that the overall energy usage of the buildings which are now targeted for green initiatives only relate to a minuscule fraction of the energy use of the community. If we look at the energy used by having a CBD in the first place, as a result of having to move huge numbers of employees in and out of the city, even with the innovations with moving more people to moving closer to the city, we find that a decentralised building policy overall would return far greater benefits to the community than simply having a Green Star rating on your George Street business or your Main Street in Brisbane business. What this suggests is that apart from the fact that office blocks with their Green Star ratings are only having a tiny impact compared to the energy use of the community in general, there are other ways of returning greater benefits as a result of wise business practices which are not being considered, and these could be as simple as radical decentralisation. Overall, we can conclude that the Green Building Initiative focuses on initiatives that are only supported as a result of government policy. They are expensive and they impact negatively on the standard of living indirectly of the entire community. And their impact is really only a showpiece rather than a real change in the community's use of energy and other limited resources. The current emphasis on green buildings and the amount of resources that are being turned towards making buildings green and raising public awareness about the green building issue is a good example of the distance that there is between sound environmental science and environmental action on the ground. This distance between science and policy, or science versus action, is also evident in another aspect of the current environmental movement, and that is in the tendency to advocate precautionary policies well in advance of the actual science. To understand the operations of this precautionary principle, in other words, the idea that if in doubt the community should take environmental restraint measures, we have to first of all look at what it is lined up against. What is it in comparison to sound science? Science has been defined as certain understanding through cause. And what that means is that sound science has to do with understanding the causes with things with certainty, usually using scientific observation, and that is observation. And observation means that a scientific conclusion can only be made on the basis of scientific observation abstracted into theories which are found to be robust. Now, that scientific method has a particular rigour to it that has helped Western culture over the last 1,000 years or so to be the leading culture of humanity in the world today. However, there is quite a distinction between science as a certain understanding through cause and the operation of the precautionary principle. If we act following the dictates of science, it means that we will be taking action when the relationships are known with certainty, or at least with such a high level of probability that the possibility of science being wrong is very, very tiny. Let's contrast that to the precautionary principle. Now, this is a principle that is fairly well known amongst the environmental movement. And the precautionary principle requires that even if an environmental concern is not proven, we should act as if it was. And so that means enacting restrictions and controls even before the science is proven. And so if we are concerned, for instance, that just possibly using house electricity is maybe going to have an impact on one's health, one should switch off the electricity supply to one's house. Ultimately, because the precautionary principle requires action even before proof, it is necessarily and fundamentally unscientific, because science only recommends action after proof. The precautionary principle is wise only when the benefit-cost ratio is significantly positive. This means that if the cost of taking some precaution, some environmental precaution, is relatively low, and yet the possible benefit is very high, then even though we are acting before the science is settled, taking the precaution at least will benefit, and it won't have a significant cost. And so we need to have benefits that have a strong probability of being substantial, and we need costs that are relatively tiny. And so this means that the precautionary principle is only applicable where the compliance costs are minor. Now, if we look at what we've gone through in the foregoing, it may be the case that humans are having some kind of an impact on the climate. However, the doubts are so considerable as to whether or not they are, and certainly in the terms that are currently understood, that even if those doubts are not completely realized, and unfortunately it seems that they are more likely because of their nature, their number, and their variety, but even if those doubts were unfounded, the fact that these significant doubts exist today means that the benefits of environmental controls, such as the control of so-called carbon pollution, are really quite doubtful. Tim Flannery, the Australian government's chief representative and proponent of anthropogenic global warming, is of the opinion that the current controls enacted by the Commonwealth Government are not likely to have an effect for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. And so what this means is that by nature the benefits are just about impossible for anybody today to be able to quantify with any sort of scientific certainty. Overall, this leads to considerable concerns as to whether these benefits are in fact realistic, and whether or not we have the capacity to perhaps find other ways of adapting that are going to have better cost-benefit outcomes in the future. Overall, it means, therefore, that the current regime of environmental concerns and policies towards supposedly controlling climate change, in fact, have a very doubtful positive benefit. By contrast, when we look at the costs, they're far from marginal. And so by taking the precautionary principle with respect to so-called carbon pollution, the costs will involve a huge change to the economy and living standards of the Australian society, and in fact any society that undertakes to take them on, which is perhaps why very few countries have. While there is a certain push towards the creation of carbon trading and so on, we find that tends to be more from the investment markets than from the scientific community. And we find that in general they haven't been particularly successful. We also find that there are too many studies that show that the current projected policies of control of carbon use are likely to come at huge personal, social and economic cost, to the extent that entire industries are likely to be wound down in Australia and at least be sent overseas. and this means the dislocation and impoverishment, perhaps, of large numbers of people. Now, even if these concerns are overstated, what is absolutely clear is that the costs involved are not negligible. And so we have three problems with the precautionary principle. First of all, it is not scientific, and in fact, by definition, runs on faith in environmental concerns, many of which already are being shown to be highly suspect. Secondly, the precautionary principle involves high compliance costs, which could have enormous impacts on the Australian community, and in fact any other community that takes them on. And lastly, the benefits from adopting policies governed by the precautionary principle are highly doubtful, and even if the benefits are real, there may be discovered in the near future, and by near future we can talk in terms of decades or even centuries, other more satisfactory approaches to solving the apparent problem. For these reasons, what we can conclude is that the precautionary principle is a rather doubtful policy driver at the best of times, unless we can see this benefit of low cost and high benefit. And in the particular case of global warming and its application to real estate at present, it appears to be, even in its own terms, an inappropriate driver for policy. While the precautionary principle is being applied to the matter of climate change or supposed climate change, we can also look at other places where, if it was to be applied, there may be even greater reason for its adoption. However, our community has not considered it worthwhile taking the precautionary principle as a policy for general action. For instance, there are a number of people in the community that are of the opinion that eating meat is particularly bad for us. And so if we would apply the precautionary principle, we probably should wind back our beef production and in fact our meat consumption overall. There's also considerable concern today with the use of mobile phones. Do they cause cancer? I may possibly not believe that they do. However, there is a concern, and so perhaps if we were to apply the precautionary principle, we would take out our entire mobile phone system. Likewise, if we look at the problems associated with using artificial soaps and detergents, we find that they do have an adverse effect on our waterways, and in fact also the quality of the marine environment near our major cities. While some people may say that these impacts are relatively minor, others show greater concern. Applying the precautionary principle would take all detergents and artificial household chemicals out of the supermarket shelves. Plastic bags are well known for their environmental concerns, or at least that body of people in the community that are concerned and critical about the use of plastic bags. However, they continue to be used against the judgment of the application of the precautionary principle. Motor cars are considered to be environmentally problematic for a number of reasons, not just their use of fossil fuel, but the fact that they use many of our resources. Why should people use personal transport? Should they be allowed as a danger? Already it's quite evident that the use of motor cars causes considerable injury and loss of life around the world. The precautionary principle would suggest that motor cars simply should be taken off the road and replaced by public transport. And we could go on with concerns over many, many aspects which are considered to be a part of the modern developed world's standard of living. Microwave ovens are considered by some to be a cancer risk. Maybe the precautionary principle should take them out. The use of electricity we've mentioned before. And already we have actually seen studies, especially in New Zealand, of the adverse effect of high voltage lines on property prices because of those concerns. Similarly, radio transmitters, all of our wireless communication, our television and radio and communications, all use radio waves, which are concerned by some to be a cause of health problems. They should be banned and taken out. Vaccinations, they show a very clear correlation between common vaccinations given to children and considerable negative health outcomes, including autism and death. However, we continue to use vaccinations, even though in some cases we're vaccinating for diseases that haven't been seen, in Australia at least, for now many, many decades, except for those who catch these diseases as a result of vaccination itself. This is certainly the case with measles in Australia. Fluorescent lights are another supposed health hazard for humans, and yet we continue to use them. Perhaps using the precautionary principle, we should take them out as well. Likewise, cooking oils have been shown to have extraordinarily high probability of being the real cause of much of our coronary heart disease. We should take those off the shelves as well. And lastly, our whole water supply system using dams have quite evident negative consequences for the environment. Perhaps we should take out all of our dams, wind back all of our water supply as a result of the application of the precautionary principle. And there are many others. Overall, what we can see is that while all of these things do have some degree of scientific concern, and certainly there are groups within the community that are concerned about each one of these and others besides, we haven't bothered to apply the kind of rigorous controls that we're advocating in the case of carbon. Overall, what we can conclude, while investigating the significance of environmental concerns on property, is that at present, despite the popular belief, there is no settled science regarding the major environmental concerns, especially with respect to climate change. And while in the future it may become apparent that humans are causing changes to the planetary systems which are resulting in climate change, at present at least, the doubts related to the various theories that are put up have considerable scientific support. That is, the science behind the doubts regarding those hypotheses that were raised back about 30 years ago relating to anthropogenic global warming have more science behind them than the concerns themselves. What this means is that anthropogenic global warming is an unlikely possibility, at least as far as our current scientific understanding. Leading from this, we can conclude that the impact of environmental concerns on property are in fact artificial. And what this means is that the community in general is not willing to value policy related to things such as green buildings sufficiently to make a genuine impact on the market. And in fact, the moves towards green buildings and other controls on property tend to be artificial and driven largely by policy, not by popular movement. If we step back and look more generally, we find that the prospects for the future are considerably problematic. Largely, there is likely to be great economic and property-related harm from the current trends in policy related to environmental policy. Unfortunately, what we can see is that there is considerable imbalance in the popular presentation of these issues, to the extent that in many cases it has become apparent that the presentation of these problems by activists who seek to generate popular support for so-called environmental controls have in fact consciously deceived the community, and for whatever reason this deception seems to have been taken up by the media and continued even to the highest levels of government. Overall, it's important for property economists to be aware of the developments in the science of the environment, and it is prudent for property economists overall to be zealous in supporting any policy that has a genuinely scientifically demonstrable positive impact on the environment. However, at this point in time at least, it's not evident that those environmental concerns that occupy most prominence in the property industry do in fact have sufficient basis to be taken seriously.